In the winter of 2001, a demolition worker on a site along the western shore of Lake Michigan pried open a wooden shipping crate and found a brand new outboard motor inside it. Factory grease, Johnson decal, packed for a dealer that no longer existed. Nobody came for it. It sat there while the walls came down around it. Then someone threw it in a truck and drove away, and nobody wrote down where it went. And that was the end of that particular object in this particular story, though the story itself is far from over. Most people would summarize what happened in Waukegan, Illinois, the way you'd summarize any industrial closure. Factory shut, jobs gone, city hollowed out. The American deindustrialization story in one paragraph, filed, forgotten. But that paragraph is leaving something out. At its height, the complex on that lakeshore was not one of the most important outboard motor manufacturing operations on Earth. It was the most important one. When American families loaded their boats onto trailers on summer weekends, Maine to California, Florida Keys to the boundary waters of Minnesota, the engine bolted to the transom came, more often than not, from Waukegan. The company that made it controlled somewhere between 40 and 60% of the entire global market. For decades. Unambiguously. Then it was torn down in 60 days. And the land, prime industrial waterfront on one of the largest freshwater bodies on the planet, 40 miles north of Chicago, sits empty today. Not redeveloped, not repurposed. Empty. Fenced. Poisoned. This is not a story about a factory closing. This is a story about a theft. And this film is going to name it as one. Start at the real beginning, not the plaque version, the actual one. A young Norwegian immigrant named Ole Evinrude is living in Milwaukee, working as a pattern maker in a machine shop. He is 25. He is the kind of person who feels what is wrong with a machine before his mind has caught up to the problem. In his hands, in his chest, in whatever it is that makes certain people constitutionally unable to leave broken things alone. He rows a boat in his spare time. He thinks constantly about making things move faster with less effort. That is, if you strip him down to his essential mechanism, what he is. He is also living through something he doesn't yet have the language for. The gasoline engine arriving like a tide. Horses still everywhere. Steam still king in the factories. But something in the air is changing. Or rather, something is arriving in the air. The smell of petroleum combustion that will define the entire century to come. People like Evinrude feel it the way birds feel the pressure drop before a storm. It is a physical sensation, not a thought. He starts sketching. He builds. And in 1909, in a small workshop that smelled like oil and sweat, and the particular ambition of someone who cannot sleep because the solution is almost there, Ole Evinrude completes the first commercially viable outboard motor in American history. Others had tried. Others had built contraptions that sputtered and died on the water. His works. It is reliable. It is simple enough to own. You can clamp it to one boat, move it to another. A fisherman can own one. A farmer can own one. You do not need a yacht. You do not need a crew. This is the whole idea, distilled. The outboard motor is a democratizing machine. It takes the freedom of powered watercraft, previously reserved for people with money and docking facilities, and someone to maintain the thing, and hands it to anyone who can afford a reasonable consumer purchase. It says, "The lake is yours." For the next 9 decades, that promise would be manufactured in a complex of buildings on the western shore of Lake Michigan, by the hands of workers who were mostly not rich, and mostly not powerful, and mostly not consulted about any of the decisions that would eventually end everything they had built. until the day the promise blew away and the lake remained, indifferent as it has always been, to the humans who keep attaching their dreams to its shore. Outboard Marine Corporation did not grow cleanly from Evinrude's workshop. Nothing in industrial history ever does. What happened between 1909 and OMC's eventual dominance is the usual American story of mergers and consolidations. The kind of corporate genealogy that is tedious to recount and essential to understand. Because the structure of who owned what and owed what to whom is exactly how the ending was engineered. Evinrude sold his original company in 1914. He was an inventor, not an administrator. He discovered, the way American inventors keep discovering across history, that building a thing and managing a company are entirely different skills that almost never live in the same body. So he came back, built a second company, Elto, because he could not stop. The motor was not a product to him. It was the answer to a question he kept asking. Then, in 1929, came the first major consolidation. 3 companies merged. Evinrude's Elto, the original Evinrude company he had sold, and a company called Lockwood. Eventually this became, in 1936, part of what would grow into Outboard Marine Corporation, OMC, which would also absorb the Johnson Motor Company, founded by the Johnson brothers in South Bend, Indiana in 1921. Johnson was a serious competitor to Evinrude for 15 years. Then they merged too. They always merge. In 1936, the combined entity settled on Waukegan, Illinois as its primary manufacturing home. And here is where geography starts to matter, in ways that none of the corporate genealogy captures. Waukegan sits directly on Lake Michigan. Its harbor had already been developed for industrial shipping. Its workforce was a hard mixture of European immigrants, Poles, Czechs, Swedes, Lithuanians, who had come north for factory work and built around it a culture that was proud and practical, and deeply skeptical of anyone who hadn't made anything with their hands. Loyal to the Union. Loyal to the bloc. The kind of loyalty that people in finance have never understood and never needed to. Then the Great Migration accelerated. Black workers moving north from the Deep South, along the same railroad lines that had always carried things of value northward, arrived in Waukegan and found, partially, imperfectly, with all the limitations that the word found obscures, work. OMC hired them. Not from virtue, from need. The factory needed bodies, and the Great Migration provided them. The black neighborhoods that grew on Waukegan's south side in the 1940s and 1950s were not incidental to the factory. They were built by the factory, organized around its shift schedules and its wage rates, and the fact that someone in every house on those streets would be walking to the plant before dawn. Then came Mexican workers. Same pull, same basic arithmetic of need and supply. At its peak, the OMC complex employed thousands. Precise numbers move around depending on the year and the source, but in the plant's prime through the 1960s and 1970s, it was not just Waukegan's largest employer. It was the city's economic skeleton. Remove it, and the city could not stand. The people running OMC knew this. They extracted from that arrangement for as long as it was convenient. Then they extracted themselves. Before we get to the crime, the glory deserves to be named plainly, because it was real. And dismissing it to get to the dark parts faster would be its own kind of dishonesty. At the height of OMC's power, the company sold under the Johnson and Evinrude brands, and it was not a competitive market in any meaningful sense. It was a rout. OMC owned the American outboard motor market the way certain companies own certain markets. not through quality alone, not through price alone, but through the accumulated weight of 60 years of dealer relationships and consumer habit and brand recognition so deep it had become automatic. When American families thought about outboard motors, they thought Johnson and Evinrude the way they thought Kleenex and tissues. The category and the brand had collapsed into a single reflex. The machines coming off the Waukegan assembly lines were the physical components of a specific post-war American dream. The boat on the lake, the weekend trip, children who would remember that particular light on the water for the rest of their lives. OMC wasn't manufacturing engines. It was manufacturing evidence. Physical, clampable, startable evidence that the deal made with working people was being honored, that a union wage and a defined pension and a house in a real neighborhood and a motor on the back of a 14-foot aluminum boat on a Saturday in August was still available, still real. The workers who built those machines lived a version of that dream. A union wage, health coverage, a pension that said, "You give us 40 years, we give you the rest of your life." That promise was real. It was also, as the boardrooms that held it calculated quietly for years, a cost to be managed rather than an obligation to be honored. And managing that cost would eventually require destroying everything. One more thing before we move forward, and it is the thing that separates this story from every other industrial collapse story you have heard. Under the factory, under the concrete, the soil, the lake bed, there is poison. For decades, OMC discharged PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, synthetic chemicals used widely in industrial manufacturing, known by the 1970s to cause cancer, to disrupt hormonal systems, to accumulate in living tissue, and travel up the food chain with a quiet, patient efficiency that no amount of corporate legal language can make sound like anything other than what it is. Into Waukegan Harbor and the surrounding soil. Not by accident, not by negligence, by policy. The PCBs went into the water. The water carried them into the lake. The fish absorbed them. The people ate the fish. The children played on contaminated ground. The neighborhood closest to the plant, the black neighborhood, the Mexican neighborhood, the neighborhood with the least money and the fewest lawyers and the most to lose, sat on top of a slow catastrophe while the company collected its profits and its executives drove home to whichever suburb they had chosen, which was not, pointedly, Waukegan. The contamination of Waukegan Harbor is not a footnote to this story. It is the story. It is what was actually stolen. Not just jobs, not just pensions. The health of the people who lived there. The fish they were supposed to be able to eat. The clean water they were owed by the simple fact of living next to a lake. The lake was supposed to be theirs. It wasn't. Part 2. The Machinery of Certainty. The 1960s arrived in Waukegan the way prosperity arrived everywhere in post-war America. Loud, visible, chrome-trimmed and concrete-poured, and absolutely certain of itself. That certainty is worth paying attention to. Not because certainty is always wrong, but because the specific texture of OMC's certainty in that decade, the way it stopped asking questions it should have kept asking, is exactly how you build something that will later collapse in a way that seems sudden to everyone except the people who were watching closely. Nobody in Waukegan was watching closely enough. At the OMC complex, the 1960s felt like confirmation. Confirmation that the mergers had been right. That the Midwest was where the future was being built, physically and actually, on second shifts and third shifts, by men who came home smelling like cutting fluid, and women who spent 8 hours running tolerances on parts that would end up on boats from here to Oregon. The engines were selling faster than they could ship them. The dealer network was the largest in the industry. The brands were so deeply embedded in American consumer consciousness that competing against them felt, to everyone who tried, like competing against weather. OMC controlled between 40 and 60% of the global outboard motor market. Sit with that number for a second. In a functioning competitive market, that number is not supposed to be achievable. That number is the number of a company that has, through some combination of genuine quality and accumulated structural advantage, effectively ended the competition without anyone declaring it officially over. And the problem, the specific, compounding, eventually fatal problem with that kind of dominance, is that it makes the people who achieved it genuinely unable to believe it can be taken away. Managing dominance makes you stupid. Not immediately, not in ways you can see in a quarterly report, but slowly, institutionally, in the way that a muscle you never have to use becomes a muscle you can no longer rely on when you suddenly need it. The internal processes that exist to raise flags, to notice early signals, to ask whether what worked for the last 20 years will work for the next 5, those processes atrophy. The people who ran them get reassigned or pushed out. The people who say yes and ship and execute get promoted. And the company gets extraordinarily good at the specific thing it has always done, which is a fine capability to have, right up until the moment when what it has always done stops being sufficient. That moment was already in motion. Waukegan couldn't feel it yet. To understand what OMC actually was at its apex, you have to understand the physical scale of what had been constructed on that lakeshore. Not in the abstract, concretely. The Waukegan manufacturing complex was not a factory. The word factory doesn't carry enough weight. It was a self-contained industrial ecosystem. Multiple buildings, internal logistics, its own receiving docks on the lake, its own power infrastructure, machine shops and casting floors, and assembly lines, and engineering facilities and warehousing that together occupied a stretch of lakefront substantial enough that a person walking its perimeter would cover real distance. Workers who hired on in their 20s and retired 40 years later had spent essentially their entire adult working lives inside those gates. Their children sometimes did the same. The casting operations alone would stop most people in their tracks. Molten aluminum, heated past 1,000 degrees, poured into molds and forced into the shapes of engine blocks that would eventually carry families across water across the country. The noise was not the clean mechanical sound of a modern automated facility. It was something older and louder and more physical. The sound of metal being made to do something it did not naturally want to do. The sound of human industrial will being applied to raw material at scale. A sound that settled into the bodies of the people who worked there and stayed. Workers wore hearing protection the way they wore boots, automatically, because not wearing it wasn't an option you could live with for long and remain whole. The assembly lines moved at a pace calibrated to a specific and unsentimental understanding of human capacity. How fast a person can work for 8 hours without the work becoming dangerous, without the quality falling below acceptable levels. This calibration was not done from kindness. Let's be honest about that. It was done because slow work produced too few units, and damaged work produced liability. The worker existed in the operational logic of the plant as a component in a manufacturing system. A component with capabilities no machine of that era could replicate, yes, but a component. To be maintained at minimum cost and replaced when it wore out or asked for too much. The union understood this perfectly. The UAW had organized the Waukegan facility, and the relationship between labor and management was the particular armed truce that defined post-war American industrial relations at its most functional. Which is to say, functional the way a standoff is functional. Both sides fully aware of what the other will do if pushed too far. Both sides generally choosing not to push quite that far. Management wanted production at minimum cost. Labor wanted wages and benefits and a workplace that didn't kill you before you could collect what you were owed. The contracts negotiated between them were the formal expression of that tension. Every few years when they expired, the tension went public. Strikes, near strikes, slowdowns, the theatrical maximum position performances that both sides staged before arriving, exhausted and resentful, at the deal they both knew they would eventually reach. The workers won enough to build lives, real lives, union wages that could support a family in a real house in a real neighborhood, health coverage, and the pension, the defined benefit pension, the kind that does not exist in American manufacturing anymore, the kind that said plainly, "Give us 40 years, and we will give you the rest of yours." Hundreds of workers, then thousands, each one carrying that promise out of the bargaining room and into the life they built around it. The promise was real when it was made. Whether the people making it intended to keep it is a question this film is not going to let go unanswered. OMC's expansion strategy through the 1960s and 1970s is one of the most thoroughly buried chapters in this story, and burying it serves a purpose. Because if you look at it clearly, it stops looking like a business strategy and starts looking like the first phase of something deliberate. Flush with cash, OMC's leadership did what dominant American companies of that era almost universally did. They diversified. The logic was the kind that sounds unassailable in a presentation and falls apart on contact with reality. Small engine manufacturing was the core competency. A lawnmower engine was not so different from a marine engine. The American consumer who bought a Johnson outboard in the spring could theoretically buy an OMC lawnmower in the summer, an OMC chainsaw in the fall, an OMC snowmobile in the winter. Capture that consumer across all 4 seasons, and you have not a customer, but a revenue stream. They bought Lawn Boy. They moved into other product lines. They spread. And here is the thing about spreading that the presentations never quite captured. Spreading dilutes. The management attention required to run a lawnmower business is management attention not being spent on the outboard motor business. The capital allocated to acquisitions is capital not being spent on modernizing the Waukegan facility. The institutional focus that had made OMC the dominant force in one specific industry, the focus that is genuinely hard to build and genuinely easy to destroy, got distributed across product lines that were not the thing OMC actually knew how to do better than anyone else. This would have been recoverable. Companies dilute their focus and recover. It happens. But OMC diluted its focus at the precise historical moment when focus was about to become the only thing that would save it. Because the Japanese were coming, and unlike previous competitive threats, this one had been preparing for the American market for years before most people in Waukegan had heard the names of the companies that would undo them. Yamaha. Say that name in a room full of former OMC workers and watch what happens to their faces. Not explosive anger, that came and went years ago. Something quieter. The specific expression of people who watched something foreseeable happen and were not in a position to stop it. Yamaha was not a startup, was not an upstart. Yamaha was a company that had already methodically destroyed the American motorcycle industry, had entered that market with lighter, more reliable, more fuel-efficient machines, had established dealer relationships, had built consumer loyalty that compounded year over year, had done all of this with a patience and strategic consistency that American companies of that era were constitutionally incapable of matching, because American companies of that era were being run by people whose careers were measured in quarters, not decades. The motorcycle industry had watched this happen to itself and learned nothing. Or learned the lesson, but believed it didn't apply to marine. The brand loyalty is different, someone must have said in some meeting. The dealer relationships are stickier. The American boaters' attachment to Johnson and Evinrude is not the same as their attachment to the domestic motorcycle brands Yamaha had already dismantled. Maybe they believed that. I don't know. What I know is that believing it didn't make it true. Yamaha entered the American outboard market in the early 1980s with engines that were lighter than OMC's comparable models, more fuel efficient, frequently more reliable. Built with a manufacturing precision that OMC's aging Waukegan facility, tooling developed over decades, processes that had not been fundamentally modernized because there had never been sufficient competitive pressure to justify the cost and disruption of modernizing them, could not consistently match. And they were priced to take market share, not immediately profitable, strategically priced to build the dealer network and consumer base that would compound into dominance over time. The same play OMC had run in its own era of ascent, executed by a company that had studied the American market more carefully than the American market had studied it. This is not a story about superior technology. That framing gives everyone involved too clean a narrative. The real story is simpler and uglier. A dominant company, made slow by decades of unchallenged success, encountered a competitor that had been preparing for this fight while the dominant company was busy congratulating itself. OMC did not lose to Yamaha because Yamaha was brilliant. OMC lost to Yamaha because OMC had stopped doing the things that had made it OMC. Running parallel to all of this, to the diversification and the competitive erosion and the market share bleeding away year by year to Yamaha and Honda and Mercury Marine, was the environmental story. And you cannot tell one without the other. They are not parallel stories. They are the same story, experienced from two different positions in the city. The PCBs had been going into Waukegan Harbor for years, for decades, used in OMC's electrical equipment and hydraulic systems, discharged into the water with a regularity that was not accidental and not invisible. It was documented, monitored, known. The EPA placed Waukegan Harbor on the Superfund National Priorities List in 1983. PCB concentrations in the harbor sediment, in the most contaminated areas, exceeded 500,000 parts per million. The EPA threshold for hazardous waste designation is 50 parts per million. The harbor was 10,000 times over that threshold in its worst areas. These numbers were not discovered after the factory closed. They were known while the factory was running. They were incorporated into the company's legal and financial calculations, not as a moral problem to be solved, but as a liability to be managed, minimized, deferred. The difference between those two orientations, solving a problem versus managing a liability, is the difference between cleaning up what you contaminated and engineering a legal structure that eventually allows someone else to inherit the cost while you exit clean. The contamination sat beneath the neighborhood. The neighborhood sat on it and did not fully know. The people who knew most fully were the ones best positioned to leave and least inclined to tell the ones who couldn't. By the late 1980s, OMC was a company carrying weight on three sides simultaneously. Market share eroding to Asian competitors who were not going to stop. Environmental liability mounting in Waukegan Harbor, that was not going to shrink. Pension obligations accumulating for a workforce of thousands that were not going to disappear. Any one of these, managed early and directly, was survivable. Together, compounding, unaddressed, they were not. And then the company made the decision that converted a serious problem into a terminal one. A decision so specific, so avoidable, so thoroughly documented in its wrongness that it deserves its own section, its own weight. The Ficht system. In the mid-1990s, OMC's leadership acquired a direct fuel injection technology from a German engineering firm called Ficht GmbH and decided to bet the company on it. The reasoning was not insane on its face. Direct fuel injection was a genuinely promising technology. Fuel efficiency was a growing consumer concern. Regulatory pressure on marine engine emissions was increasing, and a technological leap that could leapfrog Yamaha and Mercury would solve, in a single product cycle, the competitive problem that had been grinding OMC down for 15 years. The problem was not the technology in principle. The problem was the timeline. The Ficht engines were pushed to market before the technology had been proven at the scale and under the real-world conditions of consumer marine use. They leaked oil. They ran rough in ways that engineers who had raised concerns before launch would not have found surprising. They failed in the field with a frequency and a pattern that was not random variance. It was systemic. A product-wide quality event that triggered warranty claims in volumes the reserve accounts were not remotely equipped to absorb. Dealers who had been Johnson and Evinrude loyalists for 30 years started switching. Not angrily, just quietly, practically, because their customers were coming back with broken engines and warranty problems, and the dealers had businesses to run and could not afford to stake those businesses on a product they had lost confidence in. The early internet, boating forums, fishing communities, the nascent infrastructure of consumer word of mouth at digital speed spread the reputation damage faster than any advertising campaign could contain it. The engineers who had flagged the readiness problems before launch, they had flagged them. The executives who approved the launch timeline, they approved it. The workers in Waukegan who had nothing to do with the Ficht decision and no power to reverse it, they were about to lose everything. Part 3. The Evidence File. This part does not tell a story. It lays out a record. Because what happened to OMC, what happened to Waukegan, lives primarily not in narrative, but in documents. In filings and depositions and environmental assessments and bankruptcy schedules and pension actuarial tables and EPA enforcement letters accumulating across 3 decades, in filing cabinets and federal databases. The paper is still there. It says what it says, and what it says, read consecutively, without the softening effect of corporate passive voice and legal euphemism, is a specific thing that deserves to be called by its specific name. Read it the way a prosecutor reads it. Item 1. December 22, 2000. That is the date Outboard Marine Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware. Not Illinois, not the state where the company operated for 64 years, employed thousands of workers, contaminated a harbor, and accumulated pension obligations to human beings who structured their entire adult lives around the assumption that those obligations would be honored. Delaware, where corporate bankruptcy law is most favorable to the entity filing, where the proceedings would unfold at maximum distance, geographic, procedural, psychological, from the workers in Waukegan who were about to discover what their pensions were actually worth when the company holding them decided it was finished. This is not a neutral logistical detail. Choosing Delaware is a decision. It is made by lawyers who know exactly what it means and exactly who it benefits. The workers in Waukegan did not choose Delaware. They did not choose anything. Things were being chosen for them, in offices they had never entered, by people they had never met, using a legal architecture built precisely for this purpose. Item 2. Total liabilities listed in the OMC bankruptcy filing, approximately $900 million. OMC had posted revenues exceeding $1 billion annually in its strongest years. $900 million in liabilities is not an act of God. It is not a market shock, too sudden and too large for any management team to have foreseen. $900 million in liabilities is the accumulated consequence of specific decisions made by specific named individuals over a specific period of years. Decisions about pension funding levels, about environmental remediation timelines, about warranty reserves for a product those individuals approved for launch over the objections of engineers who told them it was not ready. The people who made those decisions collected salaries and equity compensation for making them. The people who paid for them collected PBGC notices in the mail. Item 3. The Ficht warranty exposure. Internal OMC estimates reconstructed from bankruptcy proceedings placed the potential warranty liability from the Ficht direct fuel injection system at figures ranging from several $100 million upward. The exact number was disputed in court because precise acknowledgement of liability is always the first casualty of corporate legal proceedings. The moment you put a number on it, you have made an admission, and admissions are what lawyers exist to prevent. What is not in dispute? The engines failed, systematically, at a rate that was not within acceptable manufacturing variance. Dealers filed claims. Customers filed claims. The claims arrived faster than the reserves could absorb them. The engineering team that raised readiness concerns before launch documented. The executives who approved the launch timeline over those concerns documented. The Waukegan workers who had nothing to do with the decision and no mechanism to reverse it documented in the bankruptcy schedules as unsecured creditors, which is the legal system's way of saying last in line. Item 4. Brunswick Corporation, the parent company of Mercury Marine, OMC's principal American competitor, the maker of the other engine. In 1999 and into 2000, Brunswick made a series of moves toward acquiring OMC. The acquisition attempt failed. OMC's board rejected it. The reasons layered through litigation and competing accounts that both sides have continued to contest for years. But the sequence is documentable regardless of the motivations behind it. Brunswick made its move. OMC, already financially compromised and burning through strategic options, spent management bandwidth and legal resources and institutional focus resisting the acquisition. The resistance succeeded. Months later, OMC filed for bankruptcy. And then Brunswick, through its subsidiary, working inside the bankruptcy process, acquired the Evinrude brand, the Johnson brand, the intellectual property, the dealer relationships, the engine technology, the trade dress, the names that Ola Evinrude and the Johnson brothers built, that Waukegan workers manufactured under for 64 years, that carried the identity of an entire city on their decals. Without the pension obligations, without the environmental cleanup costs, without the warranty liabilities, without the workers. The transaction was legal. I want to be precise about what that means and what it does not mean. Legal is a description of what the law permits within the rules currently in force. It is not a description of what was right. It is not a description of what was owed. The law currently in force in the United States was, at that moment, and in many ways still is, structured to facilitate exactly this kind of transaction: the separation of a company's valuable assets from its accumulated obligations, the transfer of the value to a new owner unencumbered by what the previous owner did to earn it. That structure did not happen by accident. It was built, over decades, by lobbyists paid by companies who anticipated needing exactly this option. Item 5. The Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. The PBGC is the federal agency that insures private defined benefit pension plans. When a company cannot meet its pension obligations in bankruptcy, the PBGC assumes the plan. It pays the retirees, not what they were promised, what the statutory formula allows. The PBGC has caps. It has calculations. A worker who spent 38 years on an OMC assembly line, who was promised a specific monthly benefit, did not receive that benefit when the PBGC assumed the plan. They received whatever the formula, applied to their years of service, their age at plan termination, the benefit accrual rates, produced. For many workers, the gap was not marginal, not the difference between comfortable and slightly less comfortable. It was the difference between the retirement they had organized their lives around and a retirement that required them to make choices their promises had told them they would not have to make. The people who made the funding decisions that created the gap, who year after year chose to allocate capital elsewhere rather than into the pension fund, who allowed the underfunding to compound across a decade while they collected their compensation, did not face the PBGC formula. They had other arrangements. This is documented. Item 6. What stood on the OMC Waukegan campus before demolition? Assembly buildings, casting facilities, machine shops, engineering labs, administrative offices, warehousing, dock structures on the lake, internal rail infrastructure, environmental control systems, installed belatedly and partially in response to regulatory pressure after the contamination had already been occurring for decades. The environmental systems were not installed because the company decided independently to stop poisoning the harbor. They were installed because the EPA made it legally untenable to continue without them. What stands there now? Scrub grass, chain link fence, signs that say "Do not" and "Warning" and "Restricted." Monitoring wells measuring what remains in the ground. Item 7. The 60 days. Multiple former workers and longtime Waukegan residents, interviewed years after the fact, described the demolition in terms that were remarkably consistent with each other. The specific phrasing varied. The content did not. Versions of, "I drove past one week and it was still there. I drove past maybe 6, 8 weeks later, and there was nothing." 60 days is an approximation. The actual timeline of demolition of the primary structures varied across different sections of the complex. But the essential observation is accurate. Buildings that had defined the Waukegan lakefront for 6 decades were taken down at a speed that struck the people who watched it as almost violent in its efficiency. Faster than anything the plant itself had managed in its final struggling years. The speed is worth examining. Demolition costs money. Vacant structures, while not productive, are not acutely expensive to leave standing in the short term. The decision to demolish quickly, rather than leave the structures for eventual redevelopment, is a choice with consequences. It forecloses options. It removes flexibility. It is not the obvious financial decision for an entity in bankruptcy, which generally operates to preserve and liquidate assets rather than spend money destroying them. What the demolition also removes is the physical space of the thing that happened. Not the legal record, that remains. Not the workers' memories, those remain. But the specific navigable architecture, the buildings in which 64 years of decisions were made, in which contamination was discharged, in which workers were exposed to conditions they were not fully informed about, is gone. You cannot stand inside it. You cannot show it to your children and say, "Here, this is where it was. This is the scale of what we built and what was taken." That option was removed in 60 days. I do not know if that was intentional. I know that it was convenient. Item 8. PCB concentrations in Waukegan Harbor sediment. In the most heavily contaminated areas of the harbor, exceeding 500,000 parts per million. EPA threshold for hazardous waste designation for PCBs, 50 parts per million. The most contaminated sediment in Waukegan Harbor contained PCB levels 10,000 times the threshold for hazardous waste classification. These concentrations were not discovered after the plant closed. They were measured, documented, reported, and placed in federal records while the plant was operating. While workers were going through those gates every morning. While families were living in the neighborhoods adjacent to the harbor. While children were growing up next to water that the company responsible for poisoning it was, in its legal and financial planning, treating as a liability, to be managed across time, rather than a harm to be stopped and remediated immediately. The fish in Waukegan Harbor still carry PCB advisories. State of Illinois advisories warning certain populations, pregnant women, children, people who rely on the fish for regular nutrition, to limit consumption or avoid it entirely. The advisories are still in effect. The company that created the condition requiring them filed for bankruptcy in 2000 and no longer exists in a form that can be held responsible for what it did. Item 9. The names that do not appear in the press releases. Not the executives, not the restructuring advisors, not the environmental consultants who billed hundreds of dollars an hour to assess what the company's operational decisions had done to the harbor. The names that appear, when they appear, in footnotes, in PBGC claim files, in workers' compensation records, in the kind of documentation that accumulates around people whose suffering is real and whose political power is insufficient to make that suffering legible to the people making the decisions. A woman who worked the assembly line for 31 years, whose pension, after the PBGC calculation, came out at a monthly amount that required her to return to part-time work at 68. A man who spent 26 years in the casting facility, was diagnosed years after the plant closed with a pulmonary condition that his physician connected explicitly to occupational exposure, and was told by his attorney that the connection, while medically plausible, was legally very difficult to establish against a bankrupt entity. A family, father, son, the son's wife, all of whom worked at OMC. The father retired before the closure with a full pension that the PBGC subsequently reduced. The son lost his job and his health coverage simultaneously at 51 with a mortgage. The son's wife had been there 9 years and vested in nothing. These are not invented. They are the shape of what the numbers became when they became people. The pattern is documented across hundreds of workers. These 3 are representative because the pattern is that consistent. Item 10. The land. Dozens of acres of prime industrial waterfront on Lake Michigan, 40 miles north of Chicago, on one of the largest freshwater bodies on Earth, a resource of ecological and developmental value that does not require exaggeration to make impressive. Vacant for more than 2 decades. Not because there is no interest in developing it. Not because Waukegan lacks ambition for its lakefront. Because the contamination liability is real, and the Superfund cleanup process moves at the pace of federal regulatory procedures which are not calibrated for speed. And the question of who ultimately bears the cost of remediating what OMC discharged is still, in various forms, being worked through legal and bureaucratic channels that the people living adjacent to the vacant land do not control, and were not consulted in designing. The people who structured the bankruptcy are not waiting. They finished waiting years ago. Here is what the evidence file requires you to conclude. A company documented that it was poisoning a community and continued. A company was warned that its central product gamble was not ready and launched it anyway. A company accumulated pension obligations to thousands of workers and systematically underfunded them across a decade. A company, when the accumulated consequences of these choices arrived simultaneously, used the legal infrastructure available to it. Infrastructure that exists because companies like OMC spent decades and significant money ensuring it would exist, to transfer the consequences onto the people least able to absorb them and most dependent on the company honoring what it had promised. This was legal. This was also a choice. The difference between those two things is the entire moral content of this story. Legal describes the boundary of what the system permits. Choice describes what the people inside the system decided to do with the space the boundary gave them. The system permitted this. The people chose it. The workers paid it. The community is still paying it. The lake is still carrying it in the tissue of its fish. And the land sits empty. And the evidence file does not close. Part 4. The language of afterwards. You are standing on the former OMC site on a Tuesday in late October, and the first thing you notice is not the emptiness. You've been told about the emptiness. You've looked at satellite images. You are prepared for empty. What you are not prepared for is the wind. It comes off Lake Michigan at a temperature that doesn't negotiate, across ground that offers it nothing. No building, no wall, no structure of any kind to interrupt it. And it hits you with the full force of something that has been moving unobstructed across open water for 40 miles. This is what the absence of a building feels like physically. Not peaceful, not like a park. Like a removal. Like something was here and was taken, and the space where it was hasn't figured out yet what to be instead. The chain-link fence runs the perimeter. The signs say the things signs on contaminated land say. Beyond the fence, there is scrub grass, a concrete pad that used to belong to something. The partial skeleton of a dock structure the lake is reclaiming, post by post, with the patience of water that has been here longer than anything humans have built on its shore, and will be here after the last person who remembers the factory is dust. This is what 64 years of industrial dominance looks like after the lawyers finish with it. The city of Waukegan has produced plans, multiple plans across multiple administrations. Mixed-use development, recreational waterfront, economic revitalization, community-centered design. The language in these documents is the language of possibility, and it is not dishonest language. The people who wrote it mostly meant it. The gap between that language and the fence and the monitoring wells is not a gap filled with bad faith. It is a gap filled with the specific gravity of what was left behind. Cleanup costs running into hundreds of millions of dollars. a Superfund process moving at the speed of federal bureaucracy, because federal bureaucracy is the only institution with the authority and the budget to address what the responsible company discharged into bankruptcy rather than paid. A community that was promised remediation, then promised development, then promised both again, across administrations, across decades, and is still waiting in ways that have quietly stopped surprising anyone who lives there. At some point, and this is the part that the revitalization documents never quite name, a community that has been disappointed enough times stops reading the new plan with anticipation. It reads it with a particular flat attention, noting what is promised, waiting to see what is actually delivered, having learned from experience that the distance between those two things tends to be significant, and tends to be explained, when explanation is offered at all, in language that locates the failure in process rather than in the choices of identifiable people. The process, the regulatory timeline, the complexity of multi-party cleanup negotiations, the challenging economics of contaminated waterfront redevelopment. Not, the company that created this condition engineered its exit to avoid paying for it, and the community has been absorbing the cost ever since. 40 miles south, Chicago's lakefront receives billions in investment, millions of visitors, and exists as the physical expression of what a great lakefront city looks like when resources and political will converge on a shoreline. Marinas and parks and running paths and beaches, and the particular electric quality of a city that has decided its waterfront belongs to its people. The contrast between that shoreline and the one in Waukegan is not geography. It is not fate. It is the downstream consequence of decisions made in boardrooms and bankruptcy courts, of contamination allowed to accumulate, of liability engineered away, of a community left to negotiate its recovery with the tools available to communities that have already lost the thing that gave them leverage. The lake doesn't know any of this. It is still there, still cold, still carrying in its deep water fish with state advisories attached to them. Fish that still, in 2024, the Illinois Department of Public Health recommends certain populations limit or avoid, because the PCBs that OMC discharged into the harbor decades ago do not acknowledge bankruptcy filings and did not leave when the buildings came down. They moved through the ecosystem the way contamination moves, slowly, thoroughly, generation to generation, until the chemical signature of what was manufactured on that shore is detectable in the tissue of living things that have never been anywhere near a factory. The motors are still out there too, in garages and marinas and storage units across America, still stamped with the Johnson decal, still running, some of them, because OMC built engines that lasted. That is the final bitter detail of this chapter. The product outlasted everything. Outlasted the company, the community, the pension fund, the promises. Outlasted the buildings that made it. The product is fine. Everything else is the fence and the signs and the wind coming off the water, with nothing left to stop it. Part 5. The lake is yours. There's a man in Waukegan. He asked not to be named, and the asking tells you something about the texture of grief this city carries, the way it has learned to hold its own history quietly, not from shame, but from the particular exhaustion of having told the story enough times to people who listened politely and then went back to their lives. Who keeps a Johnson outboard motor mounted on a bracket in his garage. His father bought it new. His father worked the casting floor at OMC for 31 years and bought the motor with his employee discount and ran it every summer on a 14-foot aluminum boat on a lake in Wisconsin. And when his father died, he left the motor to his son. and the son kept it. Not because he boats much, not because he needs it, because getting rid of it feels like a specific kind of surrender he has not yet decided to make, and maybe never will. And he is not sure he owes anyone an explanation for that. The motor is older than he is. It still runs. He checked last spring. Dropped it in a barrel of water in the driveway, ran it for a few minutes, let it warm up. It ran clean. The way it was built to run. The way the men and women who assembled it, who checked its tolerances and tested its compression and ran it down the line and loaded it into the crate that would carry it to a dealer somewhere, built it to run. Because they were good at what they did. Because they took the work seriously in the way that people take work seriously when the work is also their identity and their income and their neighborhood and their father's story and their children's future, all collapsed into a single repeated action performed 8 hours a day for decades. They built it to last. Everything around it was built to be discarded. The Evinrude brand was discontinued in May 2020. BRP, Bombardier Recreational Products, the company that had acquired the brand through the bankruptcy process, the company that had taken the name without the liability, the intellectual property without the pension obligations, the trade dress without the workers, announced the discontinuation, citing pandemic disruption and shifting market conditions. Industry analysts noted the brand had been declining for years. The dealer network was a fraction of what it had been. The engineering investment required to meet tightening emissions regulations made the product line increasingly expensive to maintain for a market share that no longer justified the cost. Ole Evinrude's name is no longer on a motor being manufactured anywhere on Earth. The Johnson brand had gone effectively dormant earlier, its presence in showrooms reduced to memory, its place in the market taken by Yamaha and Honda and Mercury, by companies that had spent the 1980s and 1990s being described in OMC boardrooms as manageable competitive threats, and had spent those same years preparing to be something else entirely. 2 names, a century of American manufacturing history, a city that organized itself around the promise those names represented. Gone. Not through any force of nature, not through any inevitability baked into the technology or the market or the laws of industrial physics, through a sequence of choices made by people, in rooms, over time. What does Waukegan have now? It has its people, which is not a small thing and not a sentimental thing. It is a precise and important thing. Because the people of Waukegan are the people who built the engines and raised the families and stayed when the leaving would have been easier. And that stubbornness is not nothing. It is, in fact, the most durable thing the city has. It has a lakefront that is, in parts, genuinely beautiful. Lake Michigan is still Lake Michigan. The water still does what the water does, indifferent and enormous and cold. The kind of cold that clears your head and reminds you that most of human history is not visible from any given shore. It has plans. The plans are real. The intentions behind them are real. A new marina development. Proposals for mixed-use waterfront housing. Municipal investment in the areas that were never contaminated, never fenced, never posted with warning signs. The city is trying. It has been trying for 20 years, and the trying is genuine. And it is also, if you stand on the former OMC site on a Tuesday in October with the wind coming off the water, visibly insufficient to fill the space that was left. What it does not have is the thing that was taken. Not the factory specifically. Factories close. Technologies change. No one is arguing that the Waukegan outboard motor plant should have been preserved in amber. protected from competition and obsolescence and the general movement of industrial history. That is not the argument. The argument is simpler than that, and harder than that. The argument is that the workers who spent their working lives in that plant were owed what they were promised. The community that organized itself around that plant was owed a cleanup paid for by the entity that created the contamination. Paid fully, paid promptly, not deferred across decades of regulatory process while the land sits empty and the liability gets managed and the people who live next to the fence keep waiting. The city that built its tax base and its housing stock and its neighborhood infrastructure around the assumption that the plant would honor its obligations was owed a transition that acknowledged what was being taken, not a bankruptcy filing in Delaware that converted 60 years of accumulated obligation into a line item to be discharged. The argument is that abandonment is a choice, and choices have authors, and the authors of this one were not the workers, and were not the community, and were not the city. The character spine of this story is abandonment. Every chapter of it confirms that word. The diversification that abandoned focus, the product launch that abandoned caution, the pension funding that abandoned commitment, the environmental remediation that abandoned urgency, the bankruptcy structure that abandoned obligation, the demolition that abandoned evidence, the 60 days that abandoned a skyline. Abandonment is a specific act. It requires that you were present, that you had a responsibility, and that you chose to leave it. You can only abandon something you were supposed to stay with. The people who ran OMC in its final decade were supposed to stay with what the company had promised. The workers who gave their working lives to that factory were supposed to be able to count on the exchange being honored. The community whose entire physical and economic structure had been built in relationship to that plant was supposed to have a partner in the transition. Instead, they got 60 days, and then they got the fence, and then they got the plans that were going to fix it, and then they got the next plans. Somewhere in America tonight, there is a family on a lake. They have a boat, maybe a modest one, aluminum hull, a little weathered, bought used from someone who'd had it since the 90s. The motor on the back is a Yamaha probably, or a Mercury, or a Honda. They don't think about where it was made. Why would they? They think about whether the fish are biting, and whether the weather will hold, and whether the kids are going to remember this the way they remember the trips their own parents took them on lakes like this one, with water like this water. That experience, the lake in summer, the family on the water, the sense of access and ease and ordinary American freedom that the outboard motor was invented to provide. That experience is intact. Ole Evinrude's original idea, the democratizing premise of the whole thing, still works. The water is still crossable. The boats are still out there. The weekend still arrives. What is not intact is the community that built the engines that carried those families across the water for 60 years. What is not intact is the promise made to the workers who came off shift smelling like aluminum and cutting fluid, and built houses and raised children, and organized their entire lives around the expectation that the exchange was real. What is not intact is the shoreline in Waukegan that should have been cleaned and developed and returned to the people who live next to it. The product worked. The promise didn't. The man in the garage in Waukegan doesn't run the motor anymore, except to test it. He doesn't have a boat. He has thought about getting one. He has thought about putting his father's motor on a boat and going out on the lake. On Lake Michigan specifically, the lake his father could see from the window of the building where he poured aluminum into molds for 31 years. The lake that received the contamination that the company discharged and never fully paid to clean. He has thought about it. He hasn't done it yet. The motor sits on its bracket, older than he is. still running, still capable of the one thing it was built to do, still carrying in its castings and its tolerances and its specific mechanical decisions the invisible fingerprints of the hands that made it, hands that belonged to people who were told the lake was theirs, who built the machines that made that promise real for everyone else, and were left standing on an empty shore when the people who made the promise decided they were finished. The lake is still there. Nobody sent for the motor.